Hello all. Hopefully my voice is going to hold up for us here since I've had a little cold this week. That's why I haven't shot any videos really in addition to the holidays, but now I wanted to move on to, of course, the Transcendental Dialectic, of course, with Kant, moving from, as you can see, really with everything that he's done in the critique as like kind of the halfway point. Uh, the understanding, of course, being kind of his epistemology and the crunching of sensory data into concepts of the understanding, into the kind of synthetic unity, and how he talks about the anti-object and the kind of emptiness of concepts without some sort of sensory output from a possible object. Is how he really rounds off the understanding and then moves on subsequently to his metaphysical ideas. And that's, of course, done intentionally because the reason is, of course, meant to tackle these ideals, these transcendent ideals and ideas that cannot be experienced as a possible experience of sensory output, but instead as ideas that are necessary to have a cohesive, reasonable person, to be frank, as you look through his ethics later. But those ideas, of course, if we were going to tackle them, those ideas being immortality, freedom, and God, which are really subdivisions of what becomes the discipline of psychology, his views on cosmology and theology, or ritual, spiritual beliefs, whatever the case may be. So for Kant, really, using mechanisms of nature, understanding nature and the scientific object, this is a way to get closer towards understanding the architecture of what's coming from God, and understanding him, or maybe not actually understanding, but being able to learn these mechanisms in ordinance towards God. Of course, nowadays this has been done away with. So he starts with the paralogisms that mistake reason and for scientific knowledge of the soul. He's, of course, focusing on Descartes and Leibniz, and to do that, he focuses it on substance and accident of those sort of properties that they're trying to add on to their metaphysical system towards the soul. Is, of course, to Kant a failure of adding categories of the understanding into the reason. And his second one, of course, is that the soul is simple. The soul is, of course, considered this sort of simple entity, or broken down into this simplicity, because it has to have a way to escape the discovery of matter and how it can potentially arrive in different areas and times. The only way it would be able to, of course, escape is if it was simple enough to, kind of be without the realm of actually seeing it kind of empirically. And so trying to, put soul into a substance, this is just an analogy. It can't be applied to itself with the same certainty that other substances could be. So the soul can't be just this simple composite, because, for something like time, for example, for Kant, it's always the sum of the whole prior to it, and that moment prior. And so it's kind of simple. It's kind of similar to how he sees soul as simple. How could it be simple if it's a composite of a larger entity? Is really how you would get to his argument there. Then, of course, you have the personality of numerical identity, the sort of sustained consciousness. This is why this is now kind of focusing on Descartes, of course. Descartes used the assurance of himself to prove the outside world, or at least he doubted it as such, where Kant says that this is, he has it upside down, really. This is why Leibniz and Descartes, they have to reinvent dualisms over and over again to kind of make sense of the harmony of what objects out there actually are, as opposed to the appearances or the phenomena and noumena distinction, of course. And that's really his thoughts on the paralogisms. And then obviously he goes on to four antinomies, which is, of course, is space-time and its quantity. So the universe obviously is supposed to have this sort of infinite recursiveness to it, but in order for that to be, it had to have had some sort of beginning somewhere. And so how are you able to really go away with that sort of paradox of the universe having infinite time and space, but our apprehension of it not being so, is really what he's trying to do with the antinomes. These sort of paradoxes of different metaphysical questions in regards to space and time. This is the same with space. Is space infinite, or is it bounded? And obviously this comes with also questions regarding matter. Is matter infinitely divisible, or is it just made up of these atoms or monads in his sort of tradition? But also there comes relation causality, the absolute completeness of those appearances, their accidents or their alterations within the substance. But what are the causes of all those causes? What what caused that sort of linear happening of these different chain reactions to come about? Is it endless, or is these just the mechanisms of nature? This is obviously how he wants to go about towards his philosophy of freedom eventually. Do we have the freedom away from causality, or are we just the processes of this sort of natural order? And then, of course, with regards to modality, is looking at the kind of dependence of existence, the sort of necessity that's necessary, and thus you get to necessary being, the sort of ontological argument, of course. But really what he's trying to offer up, and then what eventually is taken by the Romanticists, is that human will can introduce new ways of thought, and ultimately the sort of freedom of choice to be able to have a new sort of creative introduction or rupture, if you will. The fact that human will, if I were to stand up right now, there will be things, properties, movement that will then towards my will, I'm leaving my imprint onto it. And that's kind of really how he justifies to some degree, how the universe, or at least how he sees why this argument is one of the more appealing ones, is that, the human will and its freedom had to have been introduced, in that kind of microcosm, macrocosm way towards a sort of free will of creating the world as is. And so, yeah, he's trying to, find freedom despite the sort of deterministic, what are these sort of noumenal dimensions to humanity, as it were. And so, as it goes on through the critique and his sort of metaphysical problems with the teleological argument, of course, the teleological argument is, saying that there's an order to things. Things have a sort of harmony to them, as they were in that sort of Leibniz way. But that also is dependent on there being a kind of cosmological necessity that requires a sort of architect. But of course, the ordered necessary also is dependent on the ontological argument, which he's already dispensed of. So, of course, for Kant, then, there is none of these arguments or ways of having knowledge of God. As it were, he's going to then refer to a more practical, a more moral argument, an ethical argument, basically saying that these sort of ideas are important for the human subject as a whole. Kant's a pious man. He's got one step into this sort of rational way of understanding, empirical sense output and these sort of properties of scientific nature and what that means for the human being and what they are capable of. But he also has that one foot, and this leads to the romantic notions to follow, and with the German idealists, he's still concerned with freedom, and that's really what this critique is really about, is trying to still find freedom, despite scientific discovery, and introducing the reason, after the understanding, as it were, is of course part of the. It's by design, of course, and of course this leads to his kind of introduction to the practical reason, and so that's when you get to guidance, guidance of these transcendental ideals in the ethical life. And when you really get towards the end, of course, of the critique, it's really just a kind of rehashing of the arguments throughout the book. But he talks about, the history of metaphysics and what's to come afterwards, and he drives that kind of distinction between the sense, sensory output is all that we can really know in that kind of Epicurean tradition, as opposed to Plato and the intellect, and that the senses aren't more important than this sort of innate ideas. And then, of course, that comes with the arguments of realism and experience versus innate ideas and our origins, the sort of causal arguments of God. And then the other distinction, of course, is kind of naturalistic and scientific. But yeah, this is really just a very, very rough shot of his metaphysical takes on why metaphysics isn't able to prove the knowledge of God and its boundings towards belief, and how science has no business, of course, with regards to these questions. These are important, ideas of the reason, not of the understanding. And that's really the distinction he's trying to point out here, and why he goes from sensory output to the reason eventually. it is, of course, perhaps would be interesting to lay our side note here and kind of give ourselves um, our own interpretations and thoughts instead of just giving it kind of in this kind of book report way. And of course, being the Spengler's #1 fanboy around here, I suppose, I'm always interested in what he had to say or what he might have thought of a thinker where they were placed in his sort of historical system. And so Kant obviously is someone that Spengler famously beats up on a lot because he's, as a metaphysician, he's ultimately still questioning the necessity of, a god or an ultimate being. He's actually setting the groundworks here for how this will be done away with eventually with even Schopenhauer. Only 2 generations later is going to introduce the will, and obviously he doesn't believe in God or anything like that. So it's kind of interesting to see how Kant, despite being a pious man and trying to create this sort of rule book and snapshot of his time period of where science and belief should be, ultimately get eroded away really by his own philosophy itself, as he to some degree actually breaks his own rules within the critique with regards to the antinomes, and then obviously as a victim of technological progress, some of his arguments such as there can never be human beings, or man can't communicate across the planet in these sort of long distances. Well, the telephone, of course, comes not too long after him, actually. And so it's kind of interesting to see how science and technology overpeed the rule book here, and how even the metaphysical sort of idealism, if you will, or these transcendent ideas, they are more or less just of making do, despite the fact that there is no empirical evidence here that perks the sort of Faustian interest of trying to have knowledge of everything that is possible. And so prior to, with philosophy, something like God for Descartes isn't even questionable. And so all the great metaphysical thinkers prior, they weren't questioning whether or not God actually existed, or wondering about the preconditions for really just ideals, as opposed to an architect or the sort of theistic ritual. As it were, everything is now just stripped down to its metaphor. And now you have, of course, if we go towards today, this sort of this. Of course, I have no problem with anyone trying to find meaning or faith in unlikely places by any stretch, but you can see perhaps one of the critiques, of course, within our sphere is the kind of traditional thought: is this genuine or not? Is this person actually a man of faith? And you see this in religious studies, where you have people who are just cold rationalists or empiricists who talk of these ideas of God, or will study theology or something like that. But these are just metaphors. They don't actually. There's nothing actually out there. There's no object. There's no substance of the soul. There's no architect or God, as it were. These are just metaphors and stories for a sort of pragmatic result of architecture or culture or whatever the case may be. These aren't actually something genuine or romantic in that sort of Spengler spring stage or something like that. This is just rational, empirical and these sort of arguments, as they were. And that's always something to take into account here with Kant to wrap up. But yeah, I hope you guys like this little rough shot of his metaphysical understandings, and I hope you guys watch the next one.